Fellas, what if fighting legends competed in the UFC? I'm talking fighting legends from boxing, I'm talking fighting legends from wrestling, multiple different disciplines, how they would do in the UFC. I'm going to be categorizing them all by champion material, so if they'd be able to become a champion in the UFC, top contender, maybe they don't become an actual champion, but you know, they'll be ranked in the top 10. UFC worthy, so they might make it to the UFC, but they won't really make it to the top level. And then not UFC worthy, where they won't even make it inside of the UFC at all. First one we've got is Mike Tyson, known for being one of the greatest, most ferocious boxers of all time, and one of the scariest combat sports athletes to ever live. I think the explosivity of Mike Tyson would definitely help him in the UFC. Look at a lot of the modern heavyweights. A lot of them are just unathletic, not explosive at all, very ploddy strikers that kind of walk forward, and they might, they might pack a punch, but they aren't really explosive. And you put them against Mike Tyson, one of the most explosive strikers in history. I think Mike Tyson, obviously, without a doubt, has the advantage there. And the only real explosive strikers these days are Sergey Pavlovich and Tom Aspinall. I'm not saying they're the only powerful strikers in the heavyweight division, but if we're talking in pure explosivity, these are the only guys that really have much explosive power, and even there, you can't really compare to Mike Tyson. But I also think the explosivity would help him because he's got the perfect build for an explosive wrestler. He's 5'10", full of muscle, which is significantly shorter than most of today's heavyweights, who tend to be 6'1", 6'2", or above. And you look at the likes of DC, who's 5'10", and how he was able to completely ragdoll people across the light heavyweight and the heavyweight division. I think Mike Tyson would be kind of like a Michael Chandler, but with better fight IQ, more power, better stamina, just better everything, to be fair. He'd be absolutely smoking people on the feet, and then if he mixes it out with the threat of the takedown, a potential double leg takedown as well with his explosivity, he'd be a top contender without a doubt in any era of the UFC. But would he be champion material? I think at least compared to the modern era, the thing that's holding him back from being a champion is the fact that his legs are useless. I mean, he's got this hunched over boxing style, which is easy to capitalize on, with, especially with a lot of the modern heavyweights, with the rise of leg kicks and everything like that, keeping people at range. And I think the heavy boxing style would mean his kicking game is useless. He's not going to be throwing up head kicks. He's not going to be kicking people. And I think that's where the likes of John Jones and Tom Aspinall would have the advantage. And if we're talking about the old era of the UFC with the likes of Mark Coleman and when the UFC first got going, I think Mike Tyson, without a doubt, would be champion material, because at the beginning of the UFC, it was just a lot of guys from different disciplines. And you've got one of the greatest boxers of all time. You throw him in there, I think Mike Tyson would, without a doubt, be a champion. But if you throw Mike Tyson with zero MMA training, so just straight prime Mike Tyson without a single day of training MMA. We've seen it before when boxers have come over to the UFC and they've been taken down, and I just think the grappling has evolved so much where Mike Tyson wouldn't really stand a chance if he didn't have any sort of grappling training. I mean, even back in the day with the likes of Kevin Randleman and Baz Rutten, the guys who had decent grappling themselves, Mike Tyson would probably have a 20% puncher's chance had he had no MMA training. But to be fair, I mean, if you look at the modern era of the UFC, you've got Chris Barnett, this 5'9" Taekwondo fighter, who's had some decent success in the UFC. So I think in the old era of the UFC, Mike Tyson would have been a top contender if he had no MMA training whatsoever. And in the modern era, I still think he'd be a top contender because for some reason the heavyweight division has barely evolved since the beginning era of the UFC. So I think Mike Tyson would always be a top contender. Muhammad Ali, another one of the most greatest boxers of all time, at least from an influential point of view. You ask most people, their inspiration, Muhammad Ali is that. But if we're talking in terms of boxing, the guy's 6'3", so he doesn't necessarily have that same explosivity that Mike Tyson would have. Definitely had the range, definitely had the ability to pick people apart with his jabs, and was very slick defensively, had a lot of willpower, but the explosivity isn't there. So he's not going to be transitioning to this explosive wrestler that Mike Tyson had. And that 20% puncher's chance that Mike Tyson would have had, again, Ali doesn't have that. He's not really known for his power. But one thing I will say he has over Tyson is his long legs. And if a guy like Muhammad Ali, who has decent fight IQ, used him to his advantage, he could definitely be using his long legs to kick people at range, add stuff to his arsenal on the feet. And on top of that, he's very light on his feet, is Muhammad Ali. If you watch his boxing fights, very, very light, always moving on the feet. And I think that would be a huge advantage over today's heavyweight division, where, like I said before, a lot of these guys are ploddy. They don't really move a lot. They really just walk forward and kind of stand and bang. I feel like Muhammad Ali would be like a high-level defensive kickboxer, similar to like a Cyril Gane. Defensively very sound, light and rangy on the feet, good chin, or also a bad grappler. And if we're talking in terms of the OG era of the UFC, like the first beginning era of the UFC heavyweight division, he'd probably be the best striker around because of his boxing ability alone. But again, he'd have a lot of grappling problems. With no MMA training, he doesn't have that same strength and explosivity that Mike Tyson would have. So he'd probably end up getting taken down in whichever era he'd be in. But to be fair, he might be given favourable matchups. A very charismatic guy, a very promotable guy is Muhammad Ali, which is the reason why he's so influential. So maybe he'd get Dana White privilege from that, I'm not too sure. But with no MMA training, I think he'd be a top contender in that old era. In the modern era, he'd probably still be ranked, but I think he would be UFC worthy. Maybe not a top contender if he had literally no grappling whatsoever. And then we've got Brock Lesnar. Had he trained MMA his whole life? Now, obviously, Brock Lesnar's a former UFC champion, so he's definitely already got champion material kicked off. Big wrestling background, like actual wrestling, not just WWE, and that he did before the WWE. Then he came straight to WWF in 2002. Which is where the what if comes in. What if he actually dedicated his life to MMA? What if he got more experience under his belt in the world of MMA? What if he trained it a lot more often? What if he had more time to train? What if he became conditioned to the sport of MMA? I mean, already he had a decent run in the UFC. I mean, he became a champion and had a couple defenses as well, which is very impressive for Brock Lesnar. But what if he actually conditioned himself properly? What if he actually had a lot more experience and went straight to the UFC? I mean, you look at his last 2 losses. It was to Cain Velasquez, who's one of the heavyweight goats, and Alistair Overeem, who was yoked on every steroid possible and had just had a running strike force previous to that fight with Brock Lesnar. And then 5 years later, he comes back against Mark Hunt and beats Mark Hunt at UFC 200. Beat the brakes off Mark Hunt. And obviously that fight ended up getting returned to a no contest because Brock Lesnar decided to hop on the steroids. But he could have been like the Mike Tyson of MMA. He could have genuinely been one of the scariest heavyweights of all time had he just dedicated his entire life to the sport of MMA. If he had done that, he would have mauled a lot of today's top heavyweights. Top 15 to top 10, Lesnar mauls all of them. You know, a lot of these guys will probably get taken down easily with Lesnar and absolutely beat the shit out of with ground and pound. And then you go into the likes of Sergey Spivak, Rosenstrike, Marcin Tybura. These guys are definitely tougher fights, but I still think Lesnar would win. And then you go to the top 5. Again, it just depends on how much he trained for MMA, how effective he was. But he could have been an unstoppable force. And I genuinely believe Brock Lesnar, had he trained MMA his entire life, could have been a modern era UFC champion. Then we've got Bruce Lee, who is probably the greatest fighter to never fight. More of an actor than a fighter. I feel like that's what he's known for, but he's in the UFC 4 game. He's had 1 fight recorded. It's not really a fight. It's more of like a kind of like a filmed sparring match, but if we take any information from that, I will say Bruce Lee, very, very quick on the feet, extremely fast on the feet, very quick striker. So what do we know about Bruce Lee? We know that he's got extremely fast reactions, which is what you want. You want those fast twitch muscle fibers, amazing endurance, almost the best striker of his era, which isn't really saying much if we compare him to the modern era, but what we know is he's an extremely quick striker. Now, he's kind of like the Royce Gracie of striking, I feel like, Bruce Lee. You know, he's not got any grappling, he's not got anything else, all he's got is striking, but if you compare him to like the guys in the first era of the UFC, that's all you really needed, because the first era of the UFC was just guys that came from different disciplines. So I think that's where Bruce Lee could have success, but I think you put him against any grappler, especially like a Gracie, he'd get taken down and submitted. So I think in the beginning era of the UFC or the old era, he'd probably just stay a top contender. If we're talking in the modern era of the UFC, I don't really think he stands a chance. Again, he's not really got any recorded fights, and even most like strikers who don't really know for their grappling have at least a decent level of grappling these days. He'd get taken down. And also, how do we know how good he's in a dogfight? How do we know how good can he take a shot? All these kickboxing matches where he's in headgear, how can he actually take a shot from like a modern day fighter? So I think in the modern day era, I don't think he'd be UFC worthy. I don't really think Bruce Lee, as good of a striker as he is and as much of an inspirational martial artist he is, he's not really known for being a fighter. He's not known for really competition. So I think in the modern era of the UFC, I don't think he'd make it. But maybe in the old era, he'd be a top contender, because the old era was literally just guys from different disciplines. Then we've got Alexandr Karelin. Also known as the Wrestling GOAT, the greatest wrestler of all time, with a record of 887 wins and 2 losses. This guy was a beast. A 3-time Olympic gold medal champion, I believe, in wrestling. He was a complete monster when it came for wrestling. He would be picking up 100 kilo plus men and completely just dumping them on their head, ragdolling the wrestlers, and he was a complete dominant, one of the most feared wrestlers of all time, and that's why he got the 887 record. And even those 2 losses that he had in wrestling were both very controversial losses as well. He's had an MMA fight before. It was kind of like it wasn't really a serious MMA fight. It was apparently fixed, but he fought a dude with a bunch of submissions to another heavy grappler. Now, I will say, even though I'm only taking a little bit from this, he had terrible striking defense in this fight. He did dominate most of the fight with his wrestling, but, you know, you put him against maybe one of the old-era UFC heavyweights, I think he'd struggle with the striking because his defense is honestly laughable, but the wrestling alone, I think he would be able to carry himself to a top fighter. He's one of the scariest fighters in history. I mean, you look at the current heavyweight division, a lot of these guys, like I said before, very ploddy, and none of them can really compare to him when it comes to wrestling. So I think he'd have a lot of success. And if you compare it to the top 5, again, it really just depends on how well he's adjusted. I think the nightmare matchup for Karelin would be somebody who's light on the feet, well-rounded, and who also has a solid grappling game. So somebody like John Jones and Tom Aspinall would be a nightmare matchup for Alexandr Karelin. But we've seen before, Daniel Cormier, Olympic wrestler, comes over to the UFC and completely dominates to the point where he's able to become a double champion. Alexandr Karelin, if DC's able to do that, and you give the correct training to Alexandr Karelin, he could have been one of the greatest of all times. I think he's definitely champion material in the old era, without a doubt. And even in the modern era, he's champion material. One of the scariest wrestlers of all time. I don't think there's a single MMA fighter in history who would be able to out-wrestle this guy. You give this guy striking, scariest man to walk the earth. Simple as. So, Alexandr Karelin, the scariest wrestler of all time, undoubtedly UFC champion in any era had he actually dedicated his life to MMA. Or even if you just throw him in there without any MMA training, who knows if, who the champion is, if he was able to take them down and maybe dominate them with the wrestling. So, UFC champion. Anyway, then we've got the Incredible Hulk. How would he do in the UFC? If we compare him to the current heavyweight rankings, his biggest strength is his strength. Very strong guys, this guy. One of the strongest heavyweights we've ever seen. Can pick people up like it's nothing. Probably has ragdoll ability. He is also probably on steroids, so I'm not sure how he's going to get past USADA, but either way, his strength is definitely his biggest strength. But the problem with Hulk is he doesn't really use that to his advantage. He doesn't really know what he's doing when it comes to the world of grappling. He gets countered a lot on the ground. He's been taken down multiple times. He's been thrown and slammed a lot. He's not the best grappler. He's more of like a powerful striker, but he's not even a great striker as well. I mean, we can see in some of his fights, he does a lot of forearm punching. He, telegraphs his shots massively with like obvious Superman punches. Can't even front kick a flyweight to the face. Also quite chinny. He's been knocked down and knocked out a few times as well, so he's a bit of a mid-striker. The pros about Hulk is that he's very strong. That's what you want in the heavyweight division. Very strong guy, probably great in the clinch, probably on steroids, kind of like a Cain Velasquez type fighter. Great recovery. He's taking a beating and he's able to recover from that pretty quickly, which is again a reason why he might be on steroids. And he's powerful as fuck. Now the cons, he's chinny, terrible striking, can't grapple, lacks defense, and let's be honest, he's a bit of an aura merchant, he's Hulk. I think he'd struggle with a lot of today's heavyweights, like the likes of Aspinall, Pavlovich, Volkov, Lewis, and Blades. Powerful guys, or guys who have at least some sort of well-rounded ability, would really put a problem on Hulk. So I can see him being like a champion material in the old era. I can see, picking up people and slamming them, maybe knocking them out on the feet. But in the current era of the UFC, he'd probably be a top contender. There's definitely a lot of contenders who will be able to beat him. I think he'd be one of these guys that picks people up, slams them, doesn't necessarily control them on the ground, just throws people about, and maybe start swinging for the fences like a Rebellis Despairer and Ngannou, and is able to land like a Hail Mary punch. But apart from that, he's probably getting slept by any semi-decent striker in the heavyweight division. Then we've got one of the greatest combat sports athletes of all time. One of the greatest of all time, undoubtedly. It's an honor to talk about this guy. It's Jake Paul. Now, Jake Paul's obviously a pro boxer, and he has said that he's going to fight in MMA, not the UFC. He said he wants to fight in PFL against Nate Diaz, so we're never going to see a UFC debut for Jake Paul. He's faced multiple former UFC fighters before in boxing, though. Knocked out the majority of them. Knocked out Woodley, Askren, and Mike Perry. Also beat Nate Diaz and Anderson Silva by decision. He's an 11-1 boxer, so he's got the boxing background. And you know what? He's not even that bad of a boxer. I know people like to clown him for his boxing. I don't necessarily agree with his antics, but as far as boxing ability goes, he's not that bad. If you compare him to a lot of the just average professionals, he's not that bad for a pro boxer. He's also got a bit of a wrestling background, but it's nothing really significant to mention. Now, he fought at 228 pounds against Mike Tyson, which obviously would translate to being 200 pounds in probably a normal fight if he was to fight at a normal weight in the UFC. Or even 185 when he fought Nate Diaz. And I think he'd probably rather fight at 185, because if he's fighting at light heavyweight, he'd be extremely undersized. So maybe a 185 would be good for Jake Paul. Now, if you look at a lot of the ranked middleweights, they'll destroy him in MMA. Even if you give him a full training camp, every ranked middleweight would destroy him. The only guy who's probably the most beatable for Jake Paul is Marvin Vettori, because he's got like a heavy boxing style. Likes to keep it on the feet a lot. But even then, Vettori usually mixes it up with his grappling at least some point in the fight. And if that happens, he'd easily take the back of Jake Paul and submit him, or at least bully him with ground and pound. And if we look at some of the other notable unranked middleweights, you've got the likes of Chris Weidman, Paul Craig, Kevin Holland, Rainy Derrida, some unranked middleweights for him. Chris Weidman then take him down and sub him. Paul Craig would beat the brakes off him with body kicks and then eventually, inevitably submit him. Kevin Holland could knock him out or submit him, I'm not bothered, and then Rainy Derrida would without a doubt submit him as well. And even if you look at like the Andre August, in other words, the cans of the middleweight division, like Ihor Portieria, Wally Alves, Cody Brundage, even the cans of the middleweight division would probably find a way to beat him. They're too well-rounded. Even though they're not necessarily UFC talented, I still think they'd beat him. If you give Jake Paul MMA training, you give him a full training camp to MMA, I still don't think he's UFC worthy. He's got decent boxing at a decent boxing level, but I've said before, even the best professional boxers in the world wouldn't survive in the UFC. So I don't think Jake Paul would either. Jake Paul, not UFC worthy. Then we've got Chuck Norris, kind of like another Bruce Lee kind of character. Great taekwondo. A lot more well-rounded than Bruce Lee, both on the feet and in other areas, which we're going to talk about. But the problem with Chuck Norris is he has no recorded real fights. This dude, if he was competing, it was all the way back in 1968, which is the prehistoric era of fighting. But he has no real recorded fights. He's had some acted and scripted fights before, but apart from that, he's not really had any recorded fights. As far as grappling goes, again, I'll get onto that, but he's got, I guess, decent submission ability. He's trained with the Gracies before. And he was actually training with the Gracies before the UFC was even a thing, which is, I guess, something you can give to Chuck Norris. He's actually got a belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's got a belt in Taekwondo. He's got a belt in Judo. So he's got a belt in multiple different martial arts. So he's a pretty decent martial artist. But if we're talking in terms of the UFC, again, you've got no real recorded fights. And if he did, he was mainly a point/a no-contact fighter. And you're comparing that to the UFC, where he's going to be fighting guys like Kem Shamrock, and, you know, other guys of the early UFC era who were absolute monsters. I know he had the training with Royce Gracie, but you're talking about a point fighter versus guys who came from Pride FC, some of the most vicious MMA organizations in the world. Even though he does have those martial art abilities and all those different skills, I think he'd probably be a top contender in the old era. He'd be perfect, you know, a guy with multiple different disciplines under his belt. But if you're talking the modern era, yeah, he gets smashed to pieces. Any fighter from the modern era would smash Chuck Norris to pieces. More of an actor than a fighter, but it is what it is. Then we've got Royce Gracie. If prime Royce Gracie was to compete in 2025, now obviously he's a pioneer of the UFC, probably the first kind of star of the UFC, competed on the UFC's first ever show, and he's known for having some of the best jiu-jitsu and basically being a pioneer for jiu-jitsu as well. Went on this huge winning streak on the UFC where he was competing multiple times each night. But he was competing in 1993. He was competing in the UFC's birth age. Now, even though he was considered the greatest Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artist of all time, you look at who he was beating in his early days, they weren't fighters. They weren't MMA fighters. It was mainly boxers and kickboxers. It was even fighting debutants at some point. He faced a wrestler one time in Kem Shamrock, where he got the submission. But apart from that, he wasn't really facing any notable MMA fighters. And the sport's evolved. Strikers know how to grapple. Everybody knows how to grapple. It's hard to find an MMA fighter nowadays who doesn't have like at least a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We've seen it where Kron Gracie came over to the UFC and he got picked apart by different strikers. I know he's kind of related to Royce Gracie as well. We saw him against Bryce Mitchell, where Bryce Mitchell basically dominated him with the wrestling and then knocked him out by slamming him. And when we saw him against Cub Swanson and Charles Jourdain, both those guys were able to beat him and keep the fight on the feet as well. So I think it's just too outdated for Royce Gracie. Talking about him in the rankings wouldn't even be a chance. He gets demolished by every ranked fighter. And he's probably got like a 20% Hail Mary submission chance if he was to compete in the modern era of the UFC. We saw him later on in his UFC career against Matt Hughes as well, when even Matt Hughes was able to take him down and dominated and beat him with ground and pound as well. So in the modern era, not UFC worthy in my opinion. Having jiu-jitsu, you've got to have a lot more than jiu-jitsu. Everyone has jiu-jitsu these days. Maybe in the old era, I mean, we already saw he was a top fighter in the old era, but modern era, not UFC worthy. Then we've got Johnny Cage, obviously from the Mortal Kombat franchise, which is kind of known for bringing fighters. So the noteworthy skills of Johnny Cage would be his supreme kicking ability. A very fast kicker, great switch kicks, just great kicks overall from Johnny Cage, and from what I've seen, a lot of power in them as well. Very quick striker too. This dude's very lightning fast, which is what you want for a striker. Now, his martial art background, I would say, is mainly Muay Thai. I'd say that's where he kind of comes from. I think you can kind of compare him to like a Sage Northcutt nowadays. I feel like Sage Northcutt is like the perfect fighter you compare him to. He'd probably be in the middleweight division because he weighs about 185. I think some opponents that he'd be fighting, I mean, look at, there's some really good opponents for him in the middleweight division. You've got Michel Pereira, you've got Sharaputin Magomedov. There's a lot of striking matches for him I think you could have in the middleweight division that'd be really fun to see. Now, he does have no grappling, which is something you've got to note, but if the UFC gave him a career similar to like Sharaputin Magomedov, like a grappling 3 upbringing to his UFC career, and the fact that he's got charisma, so the UFC are going to want to keep him around as a star, I think Sage Northcutt could have been a top contender even in the modern era of the UFC. But that is how, in my opinion, some fighting legends and just fighting characters would do if they were in the UFC. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Thank you for watching.